Hello, hello. It's April 25th, 2023. It's a SIG Node weekly meeting. Welcome, everybody. We have a small agenda today. Lucy, you first.
Yep. Hey. Yeah, so first thing, yes, I did put my PR in the agenda. That's because someone at the Contributor Summit said this was the best way to get an approver. So I snuck it in there, but that's not the most substantive thing that I wanted to get a feel of the room for. But yes, please, if someone could look at that would be brilliant. Cool. Moving on though. Yeah, I wanted to get a feel in the room for the behavior of startup probes and readiness probes with container unhealthy events before committing to anything more serious. Right now, obviously, a startup probe and a readiness probe, it's kind of expected that they'll fail a few times before going through. It's when they do this, obviously, they emit container unhealthy events, just like any other probe would. And at least at Uber, we've been finding that sometimes that's been eating away the entire budget of 25 events per object, or near enough of it that it became painful. I guess the meta first here is, first off, do folks think that people find these events valuable, or should we turn it the other way? Yeah, that's basically, I've written down most of my thoughts on the document, really. But yeah, I just wanted to start a discussion, really.
I know they are as usable as annoying.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess
in my head, sorry,
maybe,
go ahead.
could you, in your setting, and then particularly the comment on the 25 events per resource budget,
Yep.
what are your goals to get from looking at the events? Do you actually have machine processes that are looking at the events? Are you driving alerting from the event?
Obviously, I have a PR up above there that's going to make it so that an event is emitted once a probe hits its final state. But in the meantime, what we've been trying to do is tell service owners when their service is failing to start up because the startup probe or readiness probe hasn't gone through, but not to do it unless it actually hits the failure threshold. And so the initial naive implementation that we wrote was oh, well, we'll just wait until we get the amount of events that's equal to the failure threshold and move on. Obviously, that doesn't work if your failure threshold is above 25 minus however many events you have on the resource itself. So that was pretty annoying. The other meta thing, though, is that once the startup probe or readiness probe has eaten all of these events up, then any other event that happens on that resource is also just not going to appear on the API server anymore. And that can be annoying at some times. It means there's an imperfect view. Although of course events in Kubernetes are kind of a best effort delivery, but extremely best effort, I guess, is the way to put it.
If it's okay, let me try to repeat back then what I heard. You had service owners who you're suggesting should respond to a particular event. And so does that imply that there's like a machine process that's watching for these events?
Yeah, we put all of the events we get right now into a Kafka queue.
Okay.
And then we look at them for interesting ones and throw most away.
Okay. And then that's preferenced over looking at the associated pod and container status.
We look at those too, but it's I think the best way to put it is we try and like tie the two together. So your pod died, and the reason it died is because this probe failed. That sort of thing.
Okay.
I'm kind of solutionizing here about Uber specifically, but it's
okay, that's fine. I guess I was just trying to see if the dependency on the event was a symptom of something missing on the API resource itself, or if there was some other correlation that you're performing. It sounds like the latter.
Mm-hmm.
So
better for me when I was looking at this was that events are, in my head, pretty expensive. You only get 25 of them, and then you get another one every 5 minutes. And to spend them on saying, by the way, the startup probes reported the containers unhealthy, which is kind of what we expect and doesn't actually lead to any change in the system, feels a bit odd, but maybe I'm wrong here.
I think the worst part is when readiness starts failing and then liveness finally will fail, you will miss liveness failure because readiness already put up all the.
I think earlier I said liveness probes is expected. No, sorry, I messed. I'm just what's the word? I said the wrong word. But yes, that can be particularly annoying if the readiness probes fail so many times, then go through, and then the liveness probe fails. But guess what? There's no event for that.
Yeah, so it gets me to this topic, Derek. If you don't mind, I will open this
Go for it.
document first, and so I try to summarize all the improvements we will be making in probes and like what is planned in terms of like bugs and feature requests. So I split it into multiple buckets, and this bucket is likely about troubleshooting. So from troubleshooting perspective, we have few problems. Like first problem is we messed up dimension for metric a little bit. So now we don't point to specific port, and we point to like port from replica set. So we cutting out of some randomness out of metric dimension, and it makes metric less usable in some cases and more usable in other cases, but it's like in the middle. It's not like one or another. So this needs to be cleaned up. This one, yeah, this is what Lucy is working on. First PR that was posted in the document in the agenda. So this is about change of the state of probes, and it's very useful for troubleshooting because most of the failures of probes you see are just flakes, and you may not know when the real failure happens, like failure after like few flakes already reported. So this is a PR that Lucy is working on, and another thing that we noticed that we have a very good troubleshooting for failed probes, but we have very poor troubleshooting for successful probes. Like what we observe sometimes is somebody will configure probes to be on their somebody configured probes, but then there is no way to see why those probes are never failing. So there is no troubleshooting in default verbosity from logs, and there is no events on successful probes. So we never know. Like it may be like customers hitting some benign page, like some redirect page. I mean, not redirect. Redirect will be handled, but let's say some 205 or like something that is not succeeded, but it's succeeded enough that probe succeeded. So they're not testing what they need to be testing. So this is like another thing that needs to be improved. And finally, yeah, this is like I think this is from old list. Maybe it's already resolved. So it's another thing that we have a problem with exec probes when um, invalid command of exec probe will not trigger failure. So that if command is invalid, then we keep reporting it as a success, and some people got confused by that. But I think this is resolved, and I may be wrong. So those are all improvements we can make in probes, and I think Lucy, you are alluding to that. Another improvement you mentioning here is let's report less of failures and more of other events.
Yeah, I mean, the meta here is that I think we shouldn't report events to users unless they cause a change in the state of the system, in my head. Obviously, yeah, that's obviously my wild opinion there, but they're very expensive to report, and burning them all on the startup probe or the readiness probe feels like it's, especially because a lot of users, at least users I know, actually don't even know about the 25 events per object rate limit, and just become extremely confused when suddenly their events stop appearing. So yeah. By the way, yeah, I've been looking into a few of those. I just I didn't want to raise PRs against some of those issues because of the PR I already have up, and I didn't want to deal with the merge conflict. So
yeah, that's the biggest problem is fixing many bugs in the same area. Like if there is no approver around, and it takes it very complicated.
I've got tomorrow. I'm going to be working on Kubernetes all day because it's my one day of the week where I just do K8s for the whole day. So I can hit them then if you want, and just at least get some drafts ready.
Okay. So I think biggest problem with resolving any of this situation, like reporting less of unhealthy events, will be understand that we don't break anything backward compatible from backward compatibility perspective. So if customers expecting some of those events, we shouldn't break this experience.
So
I think
historically, Sergey, we have been a little more loose on events and their frequency, and obviously we've had to do that as we went from events had an unlimited budget at one point very early in Cube to now a more constrained budget per resource. I guess what I'm trying to reason through is one, Lucy, I'll look at the PR and read the comments in depth a little bit, but maybe you could help for the average pod in your environment. Like, what are the numbers of new events that you see per pod? Is it or how do you see this actually changing the typical average pod, like
I
event
mean,
consumption?
a practical example from today is we had quite a few people confused and looking into it about a service that took a pretty long time to start up and didn't have a long interval or grace period before checking its startup probes. That pod, what's the word? Immediately burned all 25 events on the startup probe. It burned like 7 on pulling in the container, on doing some other stuff scheduled, blah, blah, blah. But then it burned the remaining 18 events on these. It burned the remaining 18 events on the startup probe. And then no more events were emitted. That caused, what was it? I can't remember exactly. Sorry, it's been a long day. But that's a more practical example from today of something
Yeah, so the net of that is one should expect fewer failure events, but
yeah,
one should always expect one success event.
yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I think in my head, it's just the usefulness to a user of getting the same failure event for a readiness or startup probe, 18 times. There's not much use beyond the first time, in my opinion. But maybe you're gonna disagree with me there. But in my head, it's not particularly useful to a user to know that your startup probe hasn't passed yet. Sorry, no, not that. It's not even that. It's that your startup probe. It is useful to users to know that your startup probe has passed. It's not useful for a user to get the startup probe saying, "Hey, I'm still looking, by the way. Nothing yet, but I'm still looking." 18 times, and then when it finally does pass, if it obviously it doesn't emit anything right now, but if it was to emit an event when it passed, because of my PR that I've got right now, that event saying, "Hey, by the way, I've just passed," wouldn't go through. Oh yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and then it could be, I'm also maybe blurring the original event API with the subsequent replacement, but we used to have a count that incremented for the number of times the action had occurred. And so what I was wondering is if a lack of incrementing on that count, and I can't remember if that's in the current event API. So if you could refresh on what you're seeing, that would actually be helpful. Otherwise, I'll check after the call. But
I mean, the last time I checked how the probe worked, there's no count incrementation unless it's going on in the event collector.
Yeah, the event collector used to add a count for the similar scene events. And so then, like, if a probe was happening, if you saw the count, then maybe you could say, oh, I know I'm actually being probed or not. But either way, that's the only thing that gives me pause. I just want to check that. But otherwise, the general idea of your PR seems to be perfectly sensible.
Yeah. Oh, the PRs, by the way, aren't exactly related. The PR solves a different issue. But this is just me kind of feeling the water before committing to actually like writing an issue and writing a PR for this. Or getting a feel for whether it's even something that people would want.
Ryan?
Yeah, I was gonna just jump in here. The event recorder has a max retry limit of 12. And so it's possible we could be dropping events here if we don't send all of them to the server. Something to keep in mind on this PR. I'll link the line of the module in
Yeah.
Kubernetes that does
I
this.
think surely effectively though, being rate limited is the equivalent of being dropped anyway. Like if you only appear in the local kubelet log and not on the API server, you might as well not exist as an event.
Yeah, so historically the action, all the compaction and decision to emit was all client side. So yeah, that's why like historically you shouldn't expect an event to be present because there wasn't necessarily a guaranteed phone home from the component in question to the server to let you even know it happened. Comes into play here. So these are just, I'm trying to, ironically enough, as we're talking about caching events and throwing away events, I'm trying to also cache into my own brain here a little bit the latest state on where we were with eventing. So for this item, I think getting it tracked in the broader doc that Sergey showed is super helpful. And then right now, at least for me, I don't want to speak for everybody else, like getting redundant events doesn't seem to be providing a ton of value. And so minimizing those would be good. And it was just a question then if people are looking at the event for frequency to figure out like if a Kubernetes component has actually stalled. That's the only thing I'm trying to balance in my head. But
so that is actually what one of the teams at Uber was trying to do, and then got really confused by this rate limit because it stopped them doing it. And that's how this originally came up last week while I was at KubeCon, and then I've just got back to it.
Todd, do you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say that, yeah, so getting a bunch of events that are identical really rapidly isn't very useful, but getting them once per hour can be useful because events expire and you come back several hours later and ask a user like, hey, can you run Qcode or ScrapPod or whatever. And it is sometimes useful to have those events repeated, just because otherwise you're asking them, do you have some collector set up to collect all these events or they log somewhere? And if not, that's okay. The events are gone and they're just ephemeral.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a use case for that in regard to just readiness probes and startup probes, just as a starting point?
Yeah, I agree with Todd. Like all the flakes on the readiness probes, like even if probe has like a threshold of 3, but then you periodically need the bad patches of not ready. You want to know about those bad patches. You want to know that your service may be going down, like it has 2 readiness events, like in 2 readiness events again. So
yeah,
knowing about this flake is important.
So yeah, so we should still report these events because these are particularly useful, but maybe not at the frequency we do today and not using up basically the whole event budget. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. Yeah, every 2 minutes, not super useful, but once per hour, probably really useful.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, it's the useful stuff to me is the readiness probe failed, useful. The next X times aren't useful, but then the readiness probe has now succeeded, also useful. And I don't want that one to be drowned out by the repetitions that exist today.
Yeah, really. I was gonna say it sort of depends on the sophistication of the monitoring system. Like if they're if all your events are being aggregated and occasionally some get dropped or whatever, it doesn't matter. But if you can go look at them, but if you're just like a brand new user of Kubernetes, you don't have any of that set up, and you're just trying to, hey, something broke last night, let me run look at events this morning, and they're all gone because they expired. It'd be nice to have that repeated hourly so you can at least see what happened.
Yeah, I agree. We could work something out with that based on the event budget we have anyway. That seems fine.
and also may account for state changes, like from your PR. Like if state changed and we started getting new kind of like failures, that may be interesting.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Would this no, this use case wouldn't exactly be covered by that, because while the probe state would change, like maybe, the night before, the probe could still be in that old state by the next morning and the event will be gone by then. So this doesn't exactly cover this issue. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But I think everybody on the call agrees that some write-up is needed, and generally
Yeah.
it's a good problem to solve.
I'll write it up tomorrow.
So yeah, since I already started showing this document, I will just jump in with my agenda item. And so this document has more things that we're working on. There are like few good first issues, like reuse HTTP objects. Somebody working on that. It's just pure like programmatic kind of like refactorings that will improve performance. There is like synchronized probes issue with not respecting initial delay seconds. I think Matthias has a PR open for maybe already a year, so it needs to be looked at, and maybe we can revive and like talk to Matthias. And then there are other things, like I think the biggest thing, if you will fix, it will be great, is this one. I don't know what. So the issue is that when Kubernetes restarts, it resets all the probe statuses down to false. So if pod was like ready, and then we restarted kubelet, it will flake like flicker this pod into not ready and then to ready again, and it caused a lot of problems, especially on the high load environments. So I think this is the biggest performance issue that we can address, and if we'll do that in this release and a few other things out of this list, it will be a big win for customers. Anyway, if you have questions about the items in this list or you want to work on them, please jump on in. Thank you. Next, Peter, Kubernetes drop-in config support.
Hey, everyone. So a couple weeks ago, there was conversation about finally dropping support for a number of the CLI flags that the kubelet has. And a result of this is there's a we rely on these flags in our downstream in OpenShift. And so, and for a while we've been talking, at least like passively, about having, drop-in configuration support like systemd does. Cryo also has this, where there's like a kubelet.conf.d, and that configuration will override, in alpha lexicographic order, override the kubelet.conf. And so I wanted to bring it up here. Mostly to talk about the approach of proposing the enhancement. To me, this feels like an internal implementation detail of the kubelet. It doesn't really need to communicate with much else. It just has to start recognizing a new directory of files. And to me, that implies that maybe we don't need a feature gate for this feature, and maybe not even a KEP. But I wanted to see what folks here were thinking in terms of the scope of such a change and whether this seemed appropriate. But my idea would basically be, at some point in the next release or so, kubelet starts additionally looking at files in kubelet.conf.d and overriding its configuration based on those. What do people think?
Do we have precedence of something like this in Kubernetes? I think mainly we'll have to, if we go down this path, we'll have to figure out how we override, right? Like things like lists and like what the rules are for overriding, and they should be uniform across Kubernetes.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know of any other components that have behavior like this, with the exception of Cryo, which is, an ancillary project. And we largely totally overwrite lists and most of the configuration fields. There are some configuration fields that we special handle and append. And I find this a little bit awkward, but it's just it makes it a lot less clunky for those configuration fields. So like, it would be my thought to have the fields just override by default, and then maybe come up with a fancier scheme in the future if we need something more fine-grained.
Can you give an example of what kind of configuration you're gonna override from these files? Like, I mean, specific config setting.
Yeah, so yeah, we use, so the one that we'll use it for is for the system reserved fields. So we'll use a drop-in configuration file to override system reserved in some cases. And I mean, basically any configuration field that we're currently supporting in the kubelet, we either use environment variables or CLI flags, both of which are fairly clunky because we have to basically add a systemd drop-in file to change the unit configuration of kubelet. But if we don't have the CLI flag, we'd have to change a config file directly, but there will be multiple writers to that configuration file. So for any of the fields that we allow our users to configure, it will make like reconciling that configuration more difficult. Whereas if we were to have the drop-in file support, we could just, have each of those fields be an individual file and just add that file to the drop-in configuration directory. But the system reserved is the one that comes to mind immediately.
Peter, I think to Renel's point, like, I guess my feeling on this is I don't think the drop-in config pattern is it's not a bad pattern. It seems fine for me, but I do think if we probably as a next step, it's worth seeing if we want to have anything in SIG architecture, like explicitly documented blessing or not blessing the particular pattern. But I would be a +1 on going to SIG Arch, saying that at least in the node SIG, we're interested in supporting this, and if we want to make it a part of like other Kubernetes components, like binary definition, maybe we could write down some of the initial rules out of the SIG. But I mean, this seems totally sensible to me.
Yeah, I wonder, Mark,
Cool.
on the call, is there something specific for Windows? I heard that there is some situations when Linux files will get distributed for Windows and then it was overridden somehow, like specific settings. Is it something that will be?
Sorry, what was that? I was distracted.
Yeah, we're discussing the config overrides when there is a central config and drop-in configs like patches on top of it. So I wonder if it will be applicable for Windows, or like, is there some Windows specific scenarios for that?
I've wanted to do this for containerd. I haven't seen many for the kubelet. But I'll take a look. I'm sure it could be helpful. Most of it's controlled by the registry, so you just make registry changes and then they're set, or they'll go live real time.
Okay. Yeah, I guess
Cool.
we can.
So,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to understand what the next steps, and if you're commenting on that, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. So I suppose our next step sounds like I'll propose it to SIG Arch and see if other components in the ecosystem have interest in supporting this, and then we can begin the shed process of deciding the mechanisms by which it works, and then probably after the conversation with SIG Arch, it will kind of inform whether we need a full cap and feature gate for this, to go across a bunch of different fields or a bunch of different projects or not. So yeah, that helps out. I probably will open up an issue as well to track, and so we can have some asynchronous conversation as well. So yeah, talk to SIG Arch, open up an issue, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Okay, next one, I wanted to raise awareness about sidecar cap progress. So we had this Uber issue that we posted last release, and in this Uber issue, we split everything into something we want to do before API change. Sorry, I didn't update it. It's probably done. Something we do is a huge PR, and something we do after API change. Yeah, I need to update this. So we did everything. So basically, we have a big PR now. Big PR contains main functionality for sidecars, basically whole life cycle. And a link to PR is here, like first link. So this PR is ready to be reviewed, and we hope to get it merged very early in the release cycle. And we have few PRs, as I mentioned, in Uber issue after API change. So like we will do some minor changes after this PR is done, like things like score adjustment. We didn't want to pollute this big PR because it's not a main functionality and it can be added later. So we want this PR to be merged as soon as possible. We try to limit it, and once this is merged, we have few follow-ups, but these follow-ups are very straightforward. So yeah, I don't know, Derek, if you want to call, if you want to review that, it would be great. Okay. Is there any other topics? Nothing else. Thank you everybody for attending. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.